All right, AP kiddos. So I'm going to be showing you my annotations and my brainstorming for the Packet 1 practice argument prompts, just for the first and the second prompt. So I'm not going to go through all of them. The very last one, which is the 2008 prompt, I want you all to try on your own. And then at a later time, I can upload my annotations for that one. But I'm going to go through the first two today. So you'll be able to see my annotation of the prompt itself, and you'll be able to see my brainstorming. So we're going to start with the 2007 one. So I'm going to read the prompt first. So it says, in the introduction to her book, Poison Penmanship, The Gentle Art of Muckraking, investigative journalist Jessica Mitford, 1917 through 1996, confronts accusations that she is a muckraker. So something that I'm noticing right away about this one is we can see the year, so 1917 through 1996, which tells us this is probably going to be a little bit more recent of a prompt, okay? And then we're also looking at this word where it says confronts accusations, and then it says a muckraker. So we don't know what a muckraker is at this point yet, but if it's an accusation and she's confronting it, then we can assume at this point that being a muckraker is probably not a good thing. Okay, so whatever it is, someone's accused her of being it, and she's confronting those or fighting back against those accusations. So continuing on, while the term was used by United States President Theodore Roosevelt in a 1906 speech to insult journalists who had, in his opinion, gone too far in the pursuit of their stories, the term muckraker is now more often used to refer to one who searches out and publicly exposes real or apparent misconduct of a prominent individual or business. So there's a lot to unpack in this section. So we have sort of two different definitions of this term muckraker. So I'm going to just circle the term here because we know it's going to be important. So the first definition comes from Theodore Roosevelt in 1906, and it was used to insult journalists who had, in his opinion, gone too far in the pursuit of their stories. And something I'm noticing here is the words too far, right? They're going too far. They're doing too much. So this is where we're seeing that being a muckraker is a bad thing, right? It's an insult, okay? All right, but now the term muckraker is now more often used to refer to one who searches out and publicly exposes real or apparent misconduct of a prominent individual or business. So we're seeing this idea of a muckraker actually being a good thing, right? And something that I'm noticing here a little bit is real or apparent misconduct, right? So whether or not that misconduct actually exists, this person, this journalist is like going the distance to try to expose that and try to make it known. With this more current definition in mind, Mitford was ultimately happy to accept the title Queen of the Muckrakers. So in this text, we see that she was happy to be called that. So she sees it as a compliment, right? Maybe it was meant as a bad thing, but we know that it is now, sorry about that, a compliment. Okay? Oops. So here's our prompt. Do you agree with Mitford's view that it is an honor to be called a muckraker? Or do you think that journalists who search out and expose real or apparent misconduct go too far in the pursuit of their stories? Explain your position in a well-written essay that uses specific evidence for support. So remember, we always want to take a look at what is the implied question. And the implied question here is being called a muckraker / like is muckraking a good thing, right? Is it a compliment? So remember, you're fundamentally deciding whether or not you agree or disagree with Mitford, okay? So agree or disagree, or be in the middle, right, where you're kind of qualifying. Okay, so that's where you're agreeing and disagreeing or qualifying. Remember, that's always what you're going to be doing, whether it says that or not. Okay? All right, so now I'm going to move on to another page where I'm just going to have this kind of be another little blank page here with my brainstorming. So the notes for the prompt are going to disappear for a minute. So if you need to go back, you can just pause the video and go back to the first half. All right, so new page, same prompt. So here we're going to come up with our examples. All right, so there are a couple of different ways that I would approach this prompt. I might think about this idea of investigative journalism, right? So we have things like the New York Times, or we have different like newspapers like that, right? The Wall Street Journal, that sort of expose different politicians or expose different like business scandals. And if you can think of specific instances of that, then that would be even more helpful. So not just saying, well, the New York Times does this, but giving a situation where they actually did that, okay? For example, you may or may not know that I believe it was a newspaper in Miami. I'm not going to write that down for sure, but this whole thing with the Harvey Weinstein scandal, / like that sort of Me Too thing, came from journalism, actually came from interviews and sort of tell-alls with these different women who had experienced sexual assault or felt like he was pressuring them in some way. So that can be a good situation, right, where muckraking is actually exposing something that's good, okay? Or not necessarily that the thing is good, but that it's important that it's being exposed. You might also think about the way that we as a country have this like freedom of speech. And we have this idea of like watchdogs or people who are going to kind of like watch out for politicians, especially who are being corrupt, or businesses. We could also look at like the critiques of the government. I'm going to move down here to the bottom. So critiques of the government or other, businesses, Wall Street, etc. And even just like bringing attention to international issues. So right now we're experiencing the coronavirus, right? And a lot of countries sort of kept that under wraps. So media attention to international issues, right? So this is sort of one way of approaching this prompt. Another one, I'm going to add another page here. So again, this is just one section of ideas. Another one that I thought about is kind of this like idea of like the journalism that isn't really, investigative journalism, where I'm focusing more on this idea of the apparent misconduct, right? Or in other words, focusing on things that aren't really real, because apparent just means that it's there, it's not actually proven, but it appears to be that way, right? So some examples that I came up here would be sort of like something like the National Enquirer, which sort of has those crazy news stories where it's like so-and-so was abducted by this person and then impregnated and like they're actually an alien, right? Obviously, that's not really exposing this like misconduct that we're talking about down here. You could also talk about that muckrakers are people who go to kind of too far in pursuit of the stories. So lots of times you might think of paparazzi doing this, right, with different celebrities. Or you could talk about biased coverage. So one example I thought of that we're kind of seeing now is the coverage of Meghan Markle and like Prince Harry, right? And that got so bad that they decided to step back from public life. So that would be sort of saying, it is not a good thing to be called a muckraker, that you are literally raking through the muck, right? You're kind of digging deep into things that maybe don't actually need to be dug into. Okay, so I hope that's helpful for the first one. I'm going to move on to the next one. Let me do this. Okay, so then the 2010 prompt, right? We're going to annotate the prompt first. So in his 2004 book, so again, we have a more recent idea. In his 2004 book, Status Anxiety, Alan de Botton argues that the chief aim of humorists is not merely to entertain, but to convey with impunity messages that might be dangerous or impossible to state directly. So here we have sort of our main claim here. The chief aim of humorists, or in other words, people who are trying to be funny, we'll get into that in a minute, is not merely to entertain, but to convey with impunity messages that might be dangerous or impossible to state directly. Now, you may not know the definition of impunity, but I'm going to write it out for you. If you Googled it, that's fine. But impunity is kind of like you're able to get away with things that other people might be punished for. So impunity is sort of like safety or free from punishment, right? So it's not just to entertain, but to say things that other people might be punished for. So we're thinking about maybe people who could go to prison for saying these things, or it would be literally dangerous for them to say them. Okay, so because society allows humorists to say things that other people cannot or will not say, de Botton sees humorists as serving a vital function in society. So vital here meaning necessary, right? Your vital signs are the signs that show that you're alive. You need to have them, like your heartbeat. So this vital means necessary. So because they allow humorists to say things that other people cannot or will not say, right? If you think about something that's said with like sarcasm or humor, it goes a little bit better on the ears, like it doesn't offend people as much. So in other words, having sort of harsh messages masked with humor, right? De Botton sees humorists as serving a vital function in society. Okay, so they are very important. All right, so think about the implications of de Botton's view of the role of humorists. And here they give us some really great examples. So this is really useful when they do this kind of thing in the prompt because it gives you a place to start, right? Cartoonists, stand-up comics, satirical writers. Oop, that was bad. Satirical writers, hosts of television programs, etc. Then write an essay that defends, challenges, or qualifies de Botton's claim about the vital role of humorists. Use specific, appropriate evidence to develop your position. So our implied question here is, are humorists a necessary part of society? Right? Are they necessary? And that is really open-ended, right? There's a lot of different ways that you could take this. And I am hoping that some of you were able to come up with some examples with people we've been studying right before we stopped seeing each other. So, for example, I'm going to add another page here with my examples. One thing that I'm hoping you all thought of is satire, right? Remember, people like Jonathan Swift, he was trying, even if we didn't think he was funny, he was trying to be funny and change the approach of the English towards the Irish, right? Trying to point out that they were being really inhumane by suggesting something absurd like eating babies, okay? The Onion article, even though it's silly, it is trying to say something about us as consumers, right? As opposed to being like, hey, consumers are stupid, they did it in a way trying to be humorous about it, right? Then you also have things like Saturday Night Live, if you watch that, or The Daily Show, right? Or those of you who are familiar with Stephen Colbert. So all of those people are definitely trying to critique something about society. So that's just sort of like, do we think that it's necessary to have those things? Or you could also argue, kind of taking it from a different point, are these people able to get away with saying something that other people might be, kind of attacked for saying? So if someone came out and outright attacked, political candidates, SNL does this all the time. But nobody's sitting there saying, how dare you, SNL, because it's masked with humor. right? So the other thing that I would maybe argue is, are they able to say this idea of saying things that are dangerous, right? Coming back to this idea, it might be dangerous or impossible to state directly. So I would think that there is a ton of political critique. That's one of the big ones. Or social critique, like Swift. But I'm also thinking, are humorists the only people who do this? And I personally would argue no, right? You have examples like Kendrick Lamar or Childish Gambino, or even taking it kind of way back, people like Tupac, that in their music, they had these really heavy political messages, messages about racism, messages about poverty, messages about living in the ghetto and what that meant to them. So those are the kinds of ideas that are not humorous, but they say them in a way that isn't necessarily dangerous, but they're still, critiquing something. Okay? And again, they're not merely entertaining, they are also providing some sort of critical message, right? You could also extend that to literature. So one thing that I thought of was 1984 by George Orwell. And if you have not read this book or you don't know who George Orwell is, then it's a really similar book to something like The Hunger Games, where they are trying to criticize something about society, right? The Hunger Games are sort of criticizing our dependence on television, our obsession with violence, like power struggles, all that kind of thing. So George Orwell wrote like the old school version of that. So 1984 was about that sort of dystopian society. Okay? The other thing, right, is implying that this is an absolutely necessary part of society. So you might say that humorists are not just there to entertain, right? They are necessary because they provide these kinds of critiques like we've mentioned before, right? Jonathan Swift, Stephen Colbert, The Daily Show, SNL, they're important to have them. But you could also say that there are, to some degree, entertainers or humorists that don't do that. And maybe just the entertaining part is what makes them vital enough, right? So a show like The Simpsons, there might be some messages there, but are they out to change the world? No, they're not, right? But that doesn't mean that they're any less important. So there's lots of different methods or avenues you could take with this prompt, okay? So I hope this was helpful to you. And if you want, you can email me with questions, or you can text me, or you can do the Zoom thing. So the last prompt I'm going to have you all do on your own, right? That's this one. I'm going to be going over this one another day. But I want you to try it by yourselves first. Okay? All right. I miss you guys, and I hope you're all okay and you're safe and healthy. Feel free to reach out if you need anything at all. Hopefully I'll have an update for you on the AP test soon. All right, y'all. Have a good one.